And joining me now with more in studio is Michael Reinking. He's a senior market strategist here at the NYSE. Michael, always good to have you. Welcome.
All right, thanks for having me back.
All right, let's start with the big news of the morning. Of course, trade pushing the major indexes higher, and that court order last night. What more can you tell us?
Yes, so I mean, look, these court, kind of the challenges by some of these courts in the state level, New York, Oregon, etc., were kind of well known, but actually, like, there hadn't been much coverage in terms of kind of timing and when people really had expected a ruling, right? And we got this surprise ruling last night, kind of basically saying that the tariffs that President Trump had instituted under IEEPA or IEEPA were basically illegal. So that includes the tariffs announced in the Rose Garden, the baseline 10% tariffs, all of the fentanyl-related tariffs, that were put on China, Canada, and Mexico. Right? It does leave in place all of the sectoral tariffs that were, on steel, aluminum, autos, and then the potential, kind of tariffs on things like pharmaceuticals, chips that he's kind of suggested will ultimately be done. Now, this kind of adds another layer of uncertainty to kind of a very uncertain situation, right? Because there are a couple different routes that the administration can go. They can turn to some other trade law, but typically that some of those other those other pieces of law, they are kind of more restrictive. They would potentially require an act of Congress or a formal investigation, right? So it does defang some of the tariff threats, that the administration has, but it may not necessarily kind of completely derail, kind of the trade negotiations. But from a market perspective, right? Markets had started to get a little desensitized to some of those trade headlines. They were, things seemed to be moving in the right direction, and had become much more transactional in nature. And now this just kind of adds just another layer of uncertainty, and we don't know exactly where things go.
We did see that Goldman had said they think the president will find a workaround to this court order. That perhaps is reflected. Again, we do see the stocks higher, but the S&P 500 only up, fractionally versus, let's say, 1-3% gain on this particular news.
Yes.
So I think you're right. We have to see how it shakes out. But decent results from NVIDIA, in fact, and that stock up about 5%. What sort of impact does that, as a mega cap company, have on the major indices?
Yeah, so I mean, this is definitely having a very big impact, kind of for kind of the S&P and major market indices. About, with the stock up about 5%, it's almost 20 points for the S&P 500 as a standalone, but it also is bleeding in kind of to the rest of that AI complex and other kind of semiconductor names, infrastructure names, right? So it is having a broader impact. If you actually look at where futures traded kind of overnight, following the NVIDIA earnings and where kind of futures were looking this morning, the S&P traded up about just over 1.5% at the highs following those trade headlines. We were had pretty much given up all of that portion of the gains just ahead of the open.
Let's also talk about Fed minutes, right? They were out yesterday. Of course, they are backward looking. The next Fed decision on tap for June 18th, taking into account new data this morning with GDP, jobless claims. How is the economy looking to you, Michael?
Yeah, so I mean, the Fed minutes yesterday, kind of reiterated the Fed stance that they were in a kind of a holding pattern, right? Waiting to see the potential impacts of tariffs, nonetheless. So, they're going to continue to wait to see how this, kind of plays out. This morning we had claims data come in a little bit higher than we have seen recently at 240,000 for initial. We saw continuing claims hold above 1.9 million, so showing a little bit of weakness on the jobs front. And we did see a modest revision, a positive revision to GDP, though the consumption numbers were revised lower, right? So, the whole story has been that the economy, ahead of kind of the tariff turmoil that we had at the beginning of April was holding up really well, right? Now we kind of have to see how things start to progress. This is going to potentially kind of draw out that time period where kind of we have to kind of work through some of the pull forward of the demand and wait, and companies kind of and investors are going to need to wait to see how kind of policy ultimately plays out.
Yeah, I do also want to ask specifically about what we can anticipate in the weeks ahead leading into this Fed decision. I don't think there's really much expectation based on what we've heard from Chair Powell that we would see a rate cut in June. But based on the data, are you thinking that we could see one by July?
No, so I think there's very low expectations that you would see anything in June. You've actually started to see markets had moved out to Q3 in terms of when they were expecting to see the first potential rate cut. We've definitely taken quite a few rate cuts out of projections that we had seen kind of in the middle of April. So markets are now pricing in 1 to 2 cuts starting in kind of the September-October timeframe, right?
Yeah.
So we've definitely seen kind of markets readjusting on that front.
What else should our viewers be watching as we await that inflation data tomorrow?
Yeah, so kind of tomorrow is kind of month end, not quarter end. It is month end. There is some expectation that we could see some rebalancing just given the very big moves that we've seen in equities and fixed income markets, right? So you could see some pension fund rebalancing heading into the end of the quarter. And to the end of the month, and then tomorrow is also the MSCI quarterly rebalance, which is why I keep saying quarter. So that's a very big liquidity event as well,
right?
Kind of as we head into the close.
All right, Michael Reinking, senior market strategist here at the Stock Exchange. Michael, always good to get your take. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Yep.